All right, we're live. Good morning, Catholic YouTube. Welcome to City of the Immaculata. Brian here. Glad you could join me today. Got a fun one today, one I've been looking forward to presenting for you guys. And I have to admit here, and I'm always very cautious to bring controversial thoughts of mine to a public forum, as they could easily be used against me at a later date. But this is actually harmless enough. I think many theologians and historians have a certain affinity for specific people whose ideas were, if not condemned, at least negatively looked upon. And we all have at least one who if we don't agree with fully, we can at least sympathize with. And I actually have two. My two are Erigena and Abelard. And I admire these two so much in certain areas that I find it a shame that they come with the reputations that they come with. Of course, both have a certain, and the key word is certain points of theirs that are condemned. Others, we're allowed to hold without really any controversy. Now, I don't have time to cover both in one video. Erigena would be his own talk, and I can't claim to be an expert in Erigena anyways. It's an area that I'd like to actually know a little bit more about. What I know of him, I've come to respect and like, and I think his influence was greater than it's been appreciated in past centuries. On the other side, I think Abelard's story is the most interesting, the most tragic in many ways, and one of the most overlooked disputes of the Middle Ages, as well as one of the most consequential for the preceding centuries, as we really see the end of the patristic era and the beginning of the university era with the story of these two interlocutors, Peter Abelard and St Bernard of Clairvaux. And I hope you guys enjoyed my thumbnail for this one. It took me a minute I usually just like slap together thumbnails with no thought, but I kind of had fun with this one because it relates somewhat, as we'll get into, with the whole debate me bro culture that exists today. So I was kind of purposely, farcical with that thumbnail that I put together. But as with any history, there are many places I could begin with in this story, but I think it prudent to introduce you to the shift I'm alluding to here. The ending of the patristics era is looked at differently in the East than in the West. The East, they see the patristics as an era that never really ended. And the fathers of the church today are doing only what the fathers of the early church did as far as Eastern Orthodoxy is concerned. And there's a sense in which I think this is romantic, admirable, if not always true. But I, at least for now, we'll table the Eastern discussion to the side. In the West, the patristic era is really seen as ending in two different phases. We generally say it dies out in the East with the rise of Islam, with the Damascene being the last among the great Eastern early church fathers of note. In the West, there's no real consensus. Some I've seen say as early as Bede, they say as the last of the early church fathers in the West, though I think it's arguable. I tend to put it at a later date, it happening in phases as learning left the monastery and the universities began to rise, with roughly this time of Bernard himself being the last of a real patristics era thinker of note in the West. And if that is so, then we're really at a turning point here with this particular story that we're about to tell. And I think it prudent to probably set up the conflict with Abelard, um, who he was, a gloss of what he thought, but most importantly, what he represented, and to follow it with introducing Bernard and what the opposition was. So, Peter Abelard, Frenchman, savant, lover of Heloise, writer of letters, teacher. He comes to Paris in the early 12th century, sets himself up at the Notre Dame Cathedral School, which is a precursor to the soon to be formed University of Paris, where he was trained under an Anselm of Leon, not to be confused with the great Saint Anselm, Anselm of Canterbury, though there is some overlap between all of these people. But the Anselm that Abelard is trained under is a different Anselm than Anselm of Canterbury. Abelard quickly gains a reputation as a brilliant yet arrogant master who challenged philosophical realism with his account for universals through a philosophical idea that would in later centuries be known as nominalism, a topic too far afield for this discussion, yet we know that there were great consequences from this style of thought in the realm of philosophy. But he also dabbled in music and psychology, and most importantly for our discussion here, in theology. And it's his theological insights which are some of the most interesting and consequential of all of his thought. And yet you get the sense with Abelard, one, that he's not really a man humble of his talents and his capabilities. He's usually the smartest in the room, and he knows it, and he lets everyone else know it. You also get the sense that he kind of likes toying with ideas. I've heard it said that Abelard, by way of analogy, is something like a musician who likes to dissect musical arrangements, play with variations, putting ideas in places that they had never gone. And you see in him, you see this a sense of reveling in the shock that he causes to other people. Now, he's not engaging Aristotle so much. He's on the cusp of that transmission of the Aristotelian corpus. So he misses that revolution. So we're not wading into that controversy just yet, but he's still a new type of man, not like the patristic men of the earlier centuries who we find hashing out theological concepts and settling doctrine as their primary point of interests. He's more prone to poke and prod at the doctrines that are already established. And he comes to a point, and this is key, he comes to a point in his career as a logician where he teaches slash believes that he, or even we for that matter, can come to truth, can come to reality, even metaphysical realities, through our ability to reason alone, and even theological realities. He's a man before his time in that sense, right? He's an empiricist in an age where the divine guiding us in all truths was taken for granted by all. Now, he admits later in his life in a work most aptly titled the History of My Calamities, that as early as this point, he was the most famous teacher and speaker pretty much in all of Europe, certainly in Paris. Students flocked from all over to be his pupil. And you get the sense that they were very committed students in some ways, though some would later challenge him, especially as the condemnations came through. But very, very committed students and a very committed following. And during all of this, probably what he's most in the secular world most famously known for is he famously, infamously falls in love with Heloise. And their tragic romance and letters are among some of the most fascinating stories that come to us from the Middle Ages, undoubtedly. I mean, their private romance, the birth of their illegitimate son, whom they named Astrolabe, after this medieval scientific invention, It would be like the equivalent of naming your child, like automobile or like an optical lens today or something, right? So they're interesting people, no doubt. Then you have their downfall where he ends up being unmanned. We'll leave it at that. He ends up being unmanned by her family, and he retires early, so to speak, by going into solitude into a Benedictine monastery. And the solitude, though, is where he really gets into trouble, as he never really shuts his mouth and he continues teaching. Now, in the university world at the time, it's one thing, controversial enough, but lightly tolerated, if not completely understood. In the monastery, though, he quickly gains a bad reputation. In 1121, he's summoned to defend his positions on the Trinity against charges of heresy, where he was not formally condemned, but he was forced to burn his book on the grounds of heresy. It's at this juncture, at some point, that he comes to the attention of St Bernard of Clairvaux, and we must take a moment to sort of shift gears and talk about this lightning bolt of a saint. You will find in the Middle Ages, there's certain characters that arrive on the scene that are, out of all of the saints of the church in this particular time, something of just real standalone characters. There's a lot of different factors that come into play of why this is, but you take like a Saint Francis or a Saint Catherine of Siena or Saint Thomas, and in unique among the list of saints that we have in our church are some of these like high Middle Ages people, and I would place Bernard among those. And I want to read to you just quickly from Warren Carroll's The Glory of Christendom. This is the History of Christendom, Volume 3, and he's got an entire chapter dedicated to Bernard of Clairvaux. Now, Carroll has a sort of a way with prose when it comes to his way of doing history, and you kind of have to take him with a little bit of salt, but I think he's very apt here about how he describes Bernard. So beginning with this chapter, quoting Carroll, quote, "The second quarter of the 12th century of the Christian era was dominated throughout most of Christendom by a single extraordinary, indeed unique figure, St. Bernard of Clairvaux. No man before or since who held no office of power throughout his life bestrode his age as did this monk of genius, and of least but flaming passion, juridically only one of the many hundreds of abbots in the church, yet the terror and inspiration of emperors and kings, the shield and sword, and where necessary, the goad of Pope. No historical determinist theory, no calculations of material or institutional power and influence can begin to account for St. Bernard of Clairvaux and what he did. He soars above such petty analysis like an eagle." And again, I don't think, while Carroll is given to some exaggerations, I don't think he's exaggerating about Bernard there. So who are we talking about? Bernard, born in 1090 at the Chateau of Fontaine on the outskirts of Dijon in Burgundy, today France. And there seems to have been something of a religious awakening in Bernard's family, as in 1112, he, along with a good portion of his family and close intimates, said to be 30 in all, joined the monastery in one go, joining the newly formed Benedictine order of the Cistercians. And I'm putting together, it's not going to be a live, it's going to be one of my slides lectures on the history of Western monasticism, and I'll have a whole thing on the Cistercians alone. I'll probably combine the Cistercians with the Augustinians because they're closely united, but Bernard is one of these key early reforming figures within the Cistercian movement. And a few years after his joining, he was placed in charge of the Abbey of Clairvaux, from which he would forever be identified with. At the time, the Cistercians were in conflict with the older Cluniac reforms. And to give you an idea of his wit, I want to quote Bernard at length in a piece that he had written against certain luxuries of the Cluny monastery. And he says, quote, Meanwhile, course after course is brought in, Only meat is lacking, and to compensate for this, 2 huge servings of fish are given. You might have thought that the first was sufficient, but even the recollection of it vanishes once you have on the second. The cooks prepare everything with such skill and cunning that the 4 or 5 dishes already consumed are of no hindrance to what is to follow, and the appetite is not checked by satiety. The seduction of dishes is so exciting that the stomach does not realize that it is being overtaxed. End quote. Based on the force of his personality combined with his unequaled rhetorical skills, he ends up causing the explosion of the Cistercian reform movement, founding 7 monasteries on his own. His work comes down to us today in some of the most effective sermons in Christian history. I mean, so much so that I have seen, and I've in my dialogue online with various other groups, I have seen certain Eastern Orthodox, one in particular who comes to my mind, a fellow that I know who's not much kind or friendly to the Catholics overall, who absolutely loves Bernard. Early Protestants, and I imagine even some today, though I don't keep up with the Protestants so much today, but early Protestants for sure loved him. Bernard was loved by Calvin in his sermons on sacred scripture, and he's one of these few characters, kind of like a Saint Francis, who really crosses over communal lines as a beloved figure. So, backing up to a broader context, I want to spend a little bit of time on just what was happening with the rise of the universities. And this is going to be the bulk of what I want this particular talk to be about, because it's one of the most fascinating and most overlooked yet consequential developments in human history, let alone medieval history, let alone church history, the forming and the rise of the university. We're not totally certain what propelled it, but we do know that they were early on linked with the growth of certain prestigious cathedrals. What's really interesting about this is these cities at the point in this high coming into the high Middle Ages, the cities that would really become the most famous in the ancient world were not really on anyone's radar. The first to be given charters for universities, Bologna and Paris, were not part of any type of ancient prestige. Bologna, I mean, it was something of a gateway into the Italian peninsula, but beyond that, as a consequential player, it's really of no importance in the ancient world. And yet, in the changing landscape in the early part of the second millennium, a huge and important subject, but too far afield for this particular talk. And this is a period of flux and transition, and these cities are gaining places of prominence, not least of which is due to the reputations that they were earning as places for this new style of learning. Now, as far as how this new style of learning goes, they weren't totally revolutionary. The curriculums formed around what would eventually be called the liberal arts was based on ancient Greek introductory courses known as the trivium. So you would begin with logic, you would begin with grammar, then logic, then go on to rhetoric, and then a student would move on to the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. And only after all of that would they go on to study philosophy or theology, which is why young people today are so often initially overwhelmed when they first confront an Aquinas or a Scotus, because when you're looking at Aquinas's sentences commentaries, or you're looking at his Summa, or you're looking at Scotus's commentaries on the sentences, the assumption there is that you've already had all of this traditional learning behind you, and you are pretty far advanced. But some of these formulations would be solidified later than the period that we're talking about right now. So I want to keep in mind, we're still with Abelard, we're still in the very, very early period. Key takeaway is that, like, in many ways, the society of the medieval world, the medieval people were concerned and believed to be being holding true to the ancient arts of Greece, to somewhat dispel the myth that the ancient world was only rediscovered by later humanists. Medieval society, in most ways, saw themselves as part of the ancient world, from their philosophy to their views on anatomy and physiology, to how they perceived and conducted law and how the courts were conducted. They were classical Greek and classical Roman, and that was true all the way through until the Renaissance period. In the period in which Abelard comes into his own, this is still all very new. This idea of a monastic moving away from just lives of prayer and working the land to being someone dedicated to a life of learning and intellectual endeavors. And in this time, before the founding of the Franciscan, it's this intermediate period when the universities are starting to begin before the founding of the Franciscan and Dominican mendicant orders. It was still controversial how one would even afford such a thing. Because at the time, to join a monastery was a huge investment for a family. And the family would usually expect some kind of return on investment. It was usually the second or third or fourth son, however far down the line. They would send one of their younger sons into the monastery. The oldest son was usually to inherit the land. Younger sons, at least one, would get sent to this monastery, but they would expect some kind of return on investment, be that a life committed to praying for the families, or in the case of more powerful, noble families, a son could take over as an abbot of a wealthy monastery, remembering that wealth historically has been tied to land, and monastic lands were in some places quite affluent. So the idea of having this person, this son of yours, who you would be paying for to just go and learn, to what end? In theory, he could return to your home and help maybe with legal situations or something of that nature. But to pay for your son to go into the monastery, to invest his life there, only to have him dedicated to learning, in effect, to live a life that would lead to further learning, was novel and not particularly popular. Now, with the rise later of the mendicant orders, who would be dedicated to poverty and travel and not really tied to land, all of this would change. But right now, in this time of Abelard, still very controversial. In the old way, learning was confined to the monastery, and it had little to no effect on the world at large. Orthodoxy was easy to safeguard. As Europe of the 11th century was stabilizing socially, politically, economically, the spillover of the learned men coming into these newly formed cathedral schools really begins this process of wresting learning from the spiritual arm and handing it over to the secular arm. Not fully in the sense of which we mean secular today, but more in the world than cloistered away in a monastery as had been. And the objective changed in a sense too. Learning in the early Middle Ages was mostly about preservation and transmission, so as to be effective in the life of prayer and devotion, where really starting with Anselm of Canterbury, you begin to see an emphasis on disputation and logic, the concept of what we would in time refer to as scholastic learning. But you can imagine, early on, you have a man like Bernard, dedicated to reform of the Benedictine order, which was seen in the eyes of the Cistercians and many in society at large as having strayed too far from its original intent, only for him to turn towards these men like Abelard, who are engaging in this new life of learning and disputation and questioning long-held truths, in turn producing theories that seemingly, in Abelard's case, truly upending theological norms on areas as important as the Trinity, which had been hard fought over, hard won in the earlier centuries. It was going to lead to conflict eventually. But, and again, this is key, it is incorrect to have assumed and to try to make Bernard out to be this like bulwark of anti-scholasticism, as he's often portrayed to be. Bernard himself was involved in key disputations of his day. For example, his work on grace and free will would have a profound impact on the scholasticism moving forward, especially on later Franciscan intellectuals. Even Luther himself, later another reformer who admired Bernard, noted that Bernard's treatise on grace and free will was way different than the Bernard of his sermons. So to try and squeeze this history into this neat little box where, one side uses Bernard as the opposition to what would later become the scholastic tradition of Aquinas and Scotus it's entirely too anachronistic and reading too much into what's taking place. So in that event, then, what went wrong? It's really quite simple. Abelard, in his arrogance and in his hubris, took his thought too far into the realm of logic, producing errors that were truly dangerous to the faith. It wasn't learning qua learning that Bernard went after. It was learning that led to heretical ideas and conclusions that Bernard took particular umbrage with. Pope Benedict XVI, and I keep wanting to say Pope St. Benedict XVI. So if I say that, guys, in any of my lives, prematurely, Pope Benedict XVI, pray for us. I believe that he is going to be counted among the great saints. But for now, Pope Benedict XVI, in one of his papal audiences, and really, it just kind of shows how far removed we are from just even a few decades ago. Imagine a world where a papal reflection in an audience was dedicated to discussing the world of Bernard of Clairvaux and Peter Abelard. But he sums it up in his masterful way as this, quote, "In order to understand this confrontation between the two great teachers, it helps to remember that theology is the search for a rational understanding, as far as this is possible, of the mysteries of Christian revelation. Believing through faith, fides qua arens intellectum, that is, faith seeking understanding, to borrow a traditional, concise, and effective definition. Now, whereas St. Bernard, a staunch representative of the monastic theology, puts the accent on the first part of the definition, namely on fides, that is, faith, Abelard, who was a scholastic, insists on the second part, that is, on the intellectus, on understanding through reason. For Bernard, faith itself is endowed with a deep certitude based on the testimony of Scripture and on the teaching of the Church Fathers. Faith, moreover, is reinforced by the witness of the saints and by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit in the individual believer's soul. In cases of doubt and ambiguity, faith is protected and illumined by the exercise of the magisterium of the Church." So much I could talk about in just that quote alone, but trying to keep with what we're getting at here. Fides qua arens intellectum, faith seeking understanding. This is key to Augustine's work. This is key to Anselm and to Bernard. One does not approach Christianity with the mind going out in search of truth through the powers of an unfettered intellect. No, first we come to faith, and only then do we seek understanding. And at times the brake must be applied, as certain truths of the faith, according to these men and according to later scholastic greats such as Blessed John Duns Scotus, that there are articles of the faith that we could not attain apart from revelation. The Trinity, for example. And one of Abelard's key works in this hyper logical formulation is his work on the Trinity. Now, lest we be accused of fideism, as some would later accuse this way of looking, faith-seeking understanding. And it's funny because from one side, scholasticism is attacked as too logical, and from the other side as too fideistic. But the point is to ever walk the balance between the two. But beginning with a point rested in the certainties of faith, and then using our logic to move forward. And it's this that Bernard goes after with all the fervor that he applied to all of his endeavors. And you get the sense that Abelard is just not aware of exactly who his opponent is, as he tries to best Bernard by suckering him into a debate. And it's the 20th, it's the 12th century equivalent of the 21st century. Why don't you just debate him, bro? Like what are you afraid of, Bernie? You know, are you afraid that our man Abelard is just here to going to lose to the master? And you know, right, this is extremely popular today with online disputations. This stuff was going on back then too. That's why I did the thumbnail like I did for this video, as a promotion of a 20th century boxing match, because that's what it seems people really want. Not to get to the truth, not to hold firm to one's convictions, but to see who can beat the other up. But Bernard is brilliant on the worldly stage as he was on the spiritual stage, doesn't take the bait. And what happens next? Some historians are critical of how Bernard maneuvers against Abelard to have him later condemned. They'd rather he have taken the baits and beat Abelard on logical grounds. But there's a few things to remember here before I really get into what happens. One, this is still a time when heretical ideas are seen as extremely dangerous to the common good. Something Bernard, of anyone, is acutely aware of, and engaging in Abelard, in his mind, may have given credence to his falsities, or worse, given Abelard's falsities a platform with which to spread. And two, accusing Bernard of being a cruel manipulator is inconsistent with the fact that Bernard was always quite charitable to Abelard the man, if not Abelard the theologian. He attempts to communicate with Abelard multiple times to correct him of his errors, not in this grand like public disputation type way, but privately as a father to a wayward son. Abelard refused all of these overtures. He wanted to best Bernard with his possibly superior rhetorical skills, though it's debatable, as Bernard was no simpleton in the world of rhetoric. He's obviously, I mean, he's one of the greatest. He's known as the mellifluous doctor. So I have the sense that being afraid of Abelard's rhetorical skills is not why Bernard was refusing to debate him at first. But Abelard doesn't relent. Abelard's way of looking at it is, look, Bernard is publicly denouncing my propositions, and I want to publicly defend them with the great monk there to challenge me. Okay, mano y mano. So eventually, after a lot of kind of harassing Bernard, he eventually relents and agrees to meet Abelard at the Synod of Sens. But all is not what it seems with this acceptance. And again, this is a point historians want to criticize Bernard for, and maybe in a secular sense fairly so. But ultimately, what it boils down to is that Bernard just simply politically outmaneuvered Abelard. Some accounts, and I want to stress some accounts because we're not quite for sure how things went down. Some accounts says that Bernard arrives to Sens early, meets with the prelates in charge of determining the outcome of the debate, and begins to denounce Abelard before the debate was scheduled to take place. So table the controversy of this act for just a moment. You know, I wish that we had the minutes of this event so that we could see exactly what Bernard said. And I've looked for them. I have not been able to find them in English anyways. If anybody knows if there's minutes from what happened at the Synod or Council of Sens, feel free to send them to me. As it stands, I've yet to be able to find anything that survived, but we do have Bernard's letter to Rome titled A Tract on the Errors of Abelard, which probably gives us a decent idea of what Bernard said at the council. And I will quote from it here. Give me 1 second to find the page. So this is Bernard. on his tract of the errors of Abelard, with the assumption that this is probably pretty close to what Bernard says at the council. He, that is Abelard, defines faith as an opinion, as if, indeed, a man were at liberty to think and talk about it as he liked, as if sacred things of our faith depended on vague surmise and were not founded on the solid basis of certain truth. If our faith were thus unsure, would not our hope also be uncertain? How foolish our martyrs would have been to suffer so much for so long for something so doubtful. How can anyone dare to describe our faith as a mere opinion unless he has not yet received the Holy Spirit? That's a big charge there. Or is ignorant of the Gospels, or thinks them no better than fables. I know in whom I have believed and am sure, cries the Apostle Paul. And does this man mutter to me that it is only a matter of opinion? So you get to the big day of the event. Now, in the days before cable TV and internet, people love to come out and hear these disputations of these learned men, even if average Joe and average Jane had no idea of what they were arguing about. It was exciting to witness, right? So present at this assembly were some very notable men and women, including Bishop Geoffrey of Chartres, the Archbishop of Reims, a young Louis VII and Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine were there. The grandson of William Conqueror was present. It was a big name, big celebrity guest list event. Now, in fairness to history, we're not totally sure how this plays out. Again, one side says that Bernard arrived early, politically outmaneuvers and rigs the outcome against Abelard. The other side says that no, Bernard actually showed up on time, used his time as allotted, and was on time as planned. Now, we don't know, regardless, but what happens next comes to the shock of everyone, and that's that Abelard, the man who clamored for this to take place, never shows up, and he refuses to answer Bernard. He eventually concedes defeat, and the great dispute of the century, the great would-be dispute, ends honestly, kind of like 8 Mile, with Eminem defeating his opponent thoroughly before the opponent ever utters a word. Abelard, in his own attempts at political wrangling, instead writes and appeals to Rome, but Bernard, ever the calculating man that he was, had already sent all of his letters, as well as the condemnations carried through at Sens in Abelard's absence to Rome. So it was a done deal, right? The Pope sent word to Abelard to basically just, look, stop where you are, don't waste your time coming here. Now, quite providentially, Abelard was in Cluny at the time when he came under the guidance of Abbot Peter the Venerable, and an outcome that is a humble example of just how unique Abelard's story is and how unique he was. In time, under Peter's spiritual guidance, Peter the Venerable must have been quite the man, quite the spiritual director to have achieved this. But Abelard eventually repents of all of his errors. He reaches out to Bernard, and the two are fully reconciled. And Abelard is fully reconciled to the church. What many don't realize today is that Abelard died in the good graces of the Catholic Church, having fully repented of his mistakes. And it's quite astonishing, truly. So hopefully you'll see what Bernard was primarily at issue with. And there's a great quote from him. So let me attempt my Latin here for a minute. Cum de Trinitate loquitur, sapit erium, cum do gratia sapit Pelagium, cum de persona Christe sapit Nestorium. Which is to say, when he, that is Abelard, speaks of the, no, excuse me, back up. When he speaks of the Trinity, Arius is wise. When he speaks of grace, Pelagius is wise. When he speaks of the person of Christ, Nestorius is wise. So it was not about learning as such. It was not about the arrival of this new style of learning, even, as Bernard himself at times engages in it. It's really all about error, plain and simple. Abelard took logic too far and made some categorical mistakes. But Abelard himself was not without his own legacy. One of his students was none other than Peter Lombard, whose compilation of scriptural and patristic sources became the primary text of the scholastic era. And this would have a lasting effect on all of Western thought moving forward. Combined with the reintroduction of Aristotle, that and Peter Lombard's sentences, you really end up with all subsequent theology moving forward for the next several centuries. But it's this dialectic between using logic effectively and at times seeing the need to halt that would continue on, as in later centuries. For example, you would see the Franciscans at first pioneering, but also putting the brakes on certain Aristotelian propositions, where the Dominicans were more inclined to move ahead with Aristotle because of the Thomistic synthesis. So, anyways, guys, that's what I got. It's quite the story. It's quite the event. Um, it's unfortunate that the disputation that we all would clamor for, and everybody has bought their tickets, and you're ready for the big fight, and Mike Tyson doesn't show up. It's kind of like what it's like. He got bested by this little monk. You're expecting Mike Tyson in his prime to show up, and just this little wimp from some little tiny gym, in Clairvaux. Like, where's Clairvaux? I'm from Paris. I'm Abelard. And the little monk in white, little Cistercian monk, bested him, whether that be through political maneuvering, or, which is more likely, a mixture of political maneuvering and truth to power through what Bernard was effectively guarding, which was the idea of faith-seeking understanding, rather than beginning with the faith as just simply an intellectual endeavor. So that's what I got, guys. We're coming up to 41 minutes. I hope you all enjoyed this. Roberto, good to see you there in the comments. Good morning. Hello. Hopefully the weather's nice in Puerto Rico. I've heard we've got some potentially bad weather showing up, so you guys stay safe down there. I'm going to head out, guys. I'll give you just a second, maybe for any questions show up. Coming up to 42 minutes. So, okay, well, I hope you enjoyed this one. Take care, and God bless you all.